Mao Zedong, also pronounced Mao Zedong, was the most impactful Chinese leader in history. His ruthless approach to establishing his brand of communism saw perhaps 20 million people or more killed from the 1920s to 1940s during famines, civil war, and persecution. From 1958 to 1969 alone, it is estimated that over 70 million more people were tortured, executed, placed in gulags, or intentionally starved to death under the great communist leader Chairman Mao. Why did he follow a path that was so self-destructive for his country? What is his legacy as a leader and communist icon? What do we see occurring in China today that may harken back to the dark ages of Mao's reign of terror?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps scout sniper, history professor, historian, and book author. And we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History.
Mao Zedong was born on 26 December 1893 in Shaoshan Village, Hunan Province, the son of a wealthy peasant farmer, Mao Yichang. And he and his two brothers, Zemin and Zitan, had a comparatively excellent education. At age 8, Mao was sent to Shaoshan Primary School. In 1911, Mao began middle school in Changsha, and at 16 attended the higher primary school in nearby Dongshan Province, which was high school. Mao also became a Buddhist like his mother, Wen Qimei, but later became a devoted follower of communism and Leninist Marxist teachings from his early days. During this time, revolutionary winds were already blowing against Emperor Puyi and the Manchu dynasty, as Sun Yat-sen, an American-educated Christian, led the Tongminghui Society, striving for a republican form of government, which Mao supported. Mao and many others felt that the monarchy was authoritarian and did not care about the people, that they collaborated with the European powers and the Japanese who occupied Chinese soil, hence the rebellion from many sectors of society. As a result of the mass movement by several political factions, the monarchy was abolished, creating the Republic of China. But as a consolation, the monarchist Yuan Shikai became president. As a boy, Mao was very well read and interested in history, and he was inspired by military leaders and their campaigns. He studied Napoleon Bonaparte, George Washington, and American Civil War generals, as well as The Art of War by Sun Tzu. He saw that these men struggled and fought for what they believed in, whether to create a new nation or fighting to preserve one in turmoil, which inspired him. By the time he entered Peking University, he had studied politics and philosophy, such as Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations and Montesquieu's The Spirit of the Laws, as well as the works of Western scientists and philosophers. Mao believed that centralized government control would be better for the people than a free market that created competition, where the worker was at a disadvantage and disposable to those who controlled industry. He also studied men such as Charles Darwin, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, John Stuart Mill, and other influential thinkers. It is known that he kept a copy of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince and the Discourses as a reference guide. Mao also studied the American military campaigns in the West during the Indian Wars, as he saw the defiant nature of the American Indian tribes inspiring. These may have influenced his mindset as he later became a light infantry and guerrilla leader. Mao, like most Chinese, were very upset that Japan had been given Germany's former colony in China. Confirmed in the Treaty of Versailles, as Japan had been a member of the Allies in World War I, unrest was rising in the country at Japan's partial occupation, which began in 1919. After graduation, Mao had begun teaching history at the Zhuyi Primary School and was instrumental in organizing protests against the pro-Duan governor of Hunan Province, Zhang Jingyao, who earned the nickname Zhang the Venomous, due to his corrupt government and violent rule against dissenters. Mao also delved deeply into the writings of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, keeping a copy of the Communist Manifesto. This would later become his Bible, as he developed his own thoughts and philosophies. He firmly believed in the concept of universal wealth and land distribution, so that no one would be wealthy at the expense of others who would be left in poverty. His military strategies and political policies and theories are collectively known as Maoism. Mao was also influenced by one of his old teachers, Yi Peiji, a revolutionary and member of the Kuomintang, or KMT, which Mao joined. The KMT wanted a China free of Japanese influence and occupation and modeled on the Western capitalist paradigm with free markets, industrialization, and free trade. The wealthy landowners were the primary members of the KMT, which Mao found to be anathema to his communist concepts of shared land and shared wealth. This division would be the catalyst for the break between the two factions. When party leader Sun Yat-sen died in May 1925, he was succeeded by Chiang Kai-shek, who moved to distance the KMT nationalists from Mao's communists. Mao had initially supported Chiang's National Revolutionary Army, whom he saw as a potential ally against the Japanese, as Chiang launched the Northern Expedition attack on the warlords in 1926, who Mao had also been fighting. Spurred on by this expedition, many peasants supported Mao and rose up and confiscated the land of the wealthy landowners, who supported the KMT and who were often killed. These actions further alienated the KMT nationalists from the communists. Many KMT members were landowners and were not on board with communist land redistribution. In 1927, Mao supported the communist separation from the capitalist-oriented KMT, and he moved to have Chiang removed from power. Mao advocated for the death penalty or life imprisonment for anyone found guilty of counter-revolutionary activity, such as resisting land redistribution, arguing that in a revolutionary situation, peaceful methods cannot suffice. This land confiscation and redistribution disaster finally severed relations. During the Chinese Civil War between the KMT and the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, Mao founded the Chinese Workers' and Peasants' Red Army. During 1927, Chiang marched on the communist stronghold of Shanghai and unleashed the Green Gang, a notorious criminal organization who murdered at will, killing up to 25,000 pro-communist Chinese. This was when the Red Army was created, and Mao became an important commander. Mao proclaimed that even the lame, the deaf, and the blind could all come in useful for the revolutionary struggle, and he increased the army's numbers. Mao had openly called Chiang a puppet of the imperialists and a slave to the capitalists, and branded him an anti-revolutionary, which was a correct assessment. He incorporated two groups of bandits into his army, numbering an additional 1,800 soldiers. He had laid down rules for his soldiers: prompt obedience to orders, all confiscations were to be turned over to the government, and nothing was to be confiscated from poorer peasants. In doing so, he created a very well-disciplined and efficient fighting force. Mao joined forces with two leaders, General Zhu De and Lin Biao, whose army had almost been wiped out. But Zhu and Mao disagreed on the strategy they should take. Stalin had taken a great interest and supported Mao, and called Zhu to Moscow in 1929, leaving Mao in charge. Part of what helped form Mao's hatred for anything non-communist was when in November, his second wife, Yang Kui, and sister were captured and beheaded by KMT General He Jian. Some believe it was ordered by Chiang. During the Japanese occupation of China in the 1930s, Mao's communists were far more effective and reliable in fighting the Japanese forces than was the nationalist Kuomintang army under Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek. Mao led the Red Army of the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, the forerunner of the People's Liberation Army, to evade the pursuit of the National Army of the Chinese Nationalist Party, the Kuomintang. The Long March by Mao to escape the nationalists under Chiang lasted from 1934 to 1935, which reportedly covered over 5,600 miles in just over 13 months. The march was ill-conceived and not well thought out. It started out with about 100,000 people, but less than 8,000 arrived at the end through death from hunger, combat, and exposure. While on the Long March, Mao's wife, He Zizhen, had been injured by a shrapnel wound to the head. She traveled to Moscow for medical treatment, and Mao proceeded to divorce her and marry an actress, Jiang Qing. Zizhen was thrown into a Russian insane asylum. After the massive Japanese invasion of the rest of China in 1937, Mao's forces functioned as guerrilla units, operating in small units and using hit-and-run tactics, unlike the Chinese nationalists who later fought as a conventional force alongside American and British Commonwealth forces. Mao knew that without the KMT, he would not be able to defeat the Japanese. so he sent a peace offering for an alliance with Chiang, who initially refused. But after Chiang was detained by his own KMT leadership, there was the formation of the United Front, which Stalin strongly endorsed. This alliance was a smart move, because after the destruction of Shanghai and Nanking by the Japanese, the numbers within the army soared beyond 400,000 soldiers, and their counteroffensive killed over 20,000 Japanese soldiers. Once World War II became global in 1939, and Japan began to invade all of Asia and the Southwest Pacific, Allied commanders knew that Chiang viewed the Communists as a greater threat than the Japanese. Trying to get Chiang reined in to fight the Japanese and not the Communists proved to be a difficult task. However, Mao's forces also fought the Kuomintang in an ongoing civil war, only interrupted by Allied intervention to keep both parties focused upon fighting the Japanese. Chiang's response was, "The Japanese will be gone, but the Communists will still be here," to justify his use of Allied-supplied weapons against Mao and not supporting the war against Japan. U.S. forces met with Mao and the Communists as part of the Dixie Mission, who reported back to General Stilwell that the Communists were better organized, more determined, and definitely more effective at fighting the Japanese than the nationalist KMT under Chiang. However, because the KMT was anti-communist, American military aid went to Chiang at the expense of the Communists and Mao, who were supported by Stalin in a limited way. After World War II, the Civil War continued, and the Communist forces fighting the nationalist government under Chiang. After the nationalists lost the struggle due to great support from Mao from Stalin, they were forced to flee to Formosa, later renamed Taiwan. Chiang moved the government to Taipei, Taiwan, where he resumed his duties as President of the Republic of China on 1 March 1950. This was the birth of what became known as the Republic of China, juxtaposed to the Communist People's Republic of China. Mao was now the total ruler of 1/5 of the world's population at that time. In 1958, Mao launched the Great Leap Forward that aimed to rapidly transform China's economy from agrarian to industrial to compete with the industrialized West, which was an avoidable disaster. Mao's attempt to rapidly catch up to the Western industrialized world was a complete failure, as he confiscated farmland to build factories and used his hard currency to purchase steel and other metals to build up China's infrastructure. This forced many millions of Chinese farmers who would have been growing food to migrate to the major cities for work, much of it they were unqualified for, thus launching another great famine, perhaps the largest in history. This ill-conceived action led to the deadliest famine in history and the deaths of up to 55 million people, or more, between 1958 and 1962. In 1963, Mao launched the socialist education movement, banning pro-Western literature and enforcing a communist indoctrination policy. In 1966, he initiated the Cultural Revolution, a program to remove counter-revolutionary elements in Chinese society which lasted 10 years and was marked by violent class struggle, widespread destruction of cultural artifacts, and a clear demonstration of Mao's mental illness and rising cult of personality. Between 1959 and 1969, he was the chairman of the Chinese Communist Party with undisputed authority. His long-term plan was to export his brand of communism all over the world, hence his various adventures. As part of his plan, China was also heavily involved with other Southeast Asian conflicts, such as the Korean War, where he sent 300,000 soldiers across the Yalu River to support the North Korean Communist leader Kim Il-sung. He supported Ho Chi Minh during the Vietnam War, where he gave sanctuary to North Vietnamese aircraft evading American fighters, and the Cambodian Civil War, which brought Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge to power. The government under Mao was responsible for vast numbers of deaths, with estimates ranging from 40 to 80 million victims through starvation, persecution, prison labor, and mass executions, not including the deaths prior to 1959, which estimates have as between 30 and 40 million due to starvation and purges. Mao ruthlessly suppressed his people by force, including executions and placing them in gulags. He unnecessarily caused the deaths of tens of millions through his mismanagement and lack of understanding as to how to convert an agrarian economy into an industrial one. He also threatened to retake Taiwan by force, but never had the capability. He also strived to expand his brand of communism around the world, where we see China's influence even today. Sound familiar? He has been praised in some communist circles for transforming China from an agrarian third world backwater into a leading world power. The claims are that he greatly advanced literacy, women's rights, basic health care, primary education, and life expectancy. These successes are always in dispute. His own publication, The Little Red Book, contains his thoughts and philosophies, and was required reading in China, and is still popular today. The results of Mao's reign included murder, torture, the creation of the gulag system, which still exists, and several famines that killed so many Chinese that the numbers are still in dispute. Mao may have personally been responsible for up to 100 million deaths, and that is his greatest legacy.
He was the architect of a superpower, yet his hands were stained with the blood of millions. A man who ruled through fear, reshaped history, and turned his nation into a global force, but at an unimaginable human cost. Under Stalin's reign of terror, the Soviet Union underwent rapid industrialization and collectivization, transforming it into a global superpower. However, his rule was marked by brutal purges, mass executions, forced labor camps known as gulags, and widespread famine, particularly the Holodomor in Ukraine. His authoritarian control resulted in severe human rights abuses and mass repression. Who was Joseph Stalin? A visionary leader or one of history's most ruthless tyrants? His name still echoes in history, a symbol of power, paranoia, and oppression. This is his story.
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former history professor, Army and Marine Corps veteran, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History.
Joseph Vissarionovich Jukashvili was born on December 18, 1870 in Gori, Russian Empire, modern-day Georgia. He grew up in extreme poverty with an abusive alcoholic father, Vissarion Jukashvili, who frequently beat him. His mother, Kike Galadze, was a washwoman who cared for him, especially after he contracted smallpox as an infant, which left his face scarred for life. A childhood accident involving a horse-drawn carriage permanently damaged his left arm, exempting him from military service in World War I. Despite speaking only Georgian at home, Stalin learned Russian while attending the Gori Church School from 1888 to 1894. His mother wished for him to become an Orthodox priest, and he was sent to the Tiflis Theological Seminary. However, his exposure to Karl Marx and other revolutionary texts led to his expulsion in 1899, officially for ill health, but more than likely due to his radical activities. Stalin briefly worked as a clerk at the Tiflis Observatory, his only paid employment outside of politics. He soon became involved in an underground revolutionary movement, organizing labor demonstrations and strikes in the Caucasus. His excessive zeal in pushing workers into violent confrontations with the police alienated many fellow conspirators. By 1903, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party split into two factions, the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks. Stalin joined the more militant Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin, becoming a key operative. Stalin married a Georgian woman, Ekaterina Svanidze, in 1904. She died 3 years later, leaving behind a son, Yakov, whom Stalin later treated with contempt. In 1907, he orchestrated a bank heist in Tbilisi to fund the party, marking his early involvement in criminal activities for political gain. Stalin's early years were defined by arrests, imprisonments, and exiles. Despite being arrested 7 times between 1902 and 1913, Stalin consistently received light sentences, leading some Bolsheviks to suspect that he was an informant for the Tsarist police. After escaping from Siberian exile in 1917, Stalin returned to Petrograd and resumed editorship of Pravda. Initially advocating for cooperation with the provisional government, he quickly shifted to Lenin's militant stance, supporting the Bolshevik Revolution in October 1917 that overthrew the Romanov dynasty. However, Stalin played a secondary role to Leon Trotsky in the revolution. But during the Russian Civil War, in 1918 to 1921 between the Bolshevik Reds and the opposition Whites, hoping to remove Lenin's influence, Trotsky proved to be a capable commander, and the Bolsheviks eventually won. This placed Stalin in the shadow of his future primary rival. Following Lenin's death in 1924, Stalin outmaneuvered his rivals, including Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev. Lenin did not want Stalin to succeed him, but only those men were really aware of it. He consolidated power through strategic appointments and political purges, and created the Gulag system. See our video on Stalin's Cannibal Island on that subject. By the late 1930s, he had eliminated opposition and established a totalitarian regime. Friends and enemies both were sacrificed. And Trotsky, after exile, was assassinated in Mexico City in 1940. And see our video on Trotsky. Stalin's policies forcibly collectivized agriculture, seizing private farmland and placing peasants under state control. Resistance, especially in Ukraine, led to mass executions, deportations, and the Holodomor famine, which killed millions. Industrialization under successive five-year plans propelled the USSR into an industrial powerhouse, but at an immense human cost. Beginning in 1934, Stalin initiated widespread purges targeting Communist Party members, military leaders, and intellectuals. The Great Purges of 1936 to 1938 saw show trials, forced confessions, and executions of Stalin's former allies, including Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Bukharin. The Red Army suffered devastating losses, with approximately 75% of its officers purged. The greatest loss was Marshal Nikolai Tukhachevsky, Russia's greatest military genius, who had designed the Soviet military from top to bottom, organized a battle plan with contingencies using ground, air, and partisan assets in case of a future war. His loss would come back to haunt Stalin. Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Hitler in 1939, allowing the USSR to annex parts of Eastern Europe, and when Germany invaded Poland on September 1, 1939, both nations divided that country. Soviet forces then occupied the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. Stalin then took the opportunity to invade Finland in November 1939, a blunder which cost him 400,000 soldiers and ended in a truce in March 1940, giving him parts of Karelia, but it showed how deficient his military was. The poor performance of the Red Army in Finland showed the weaknesses Stalin had inflicted upon the military with his purges, but it foreshadowed an even greater disaster. In 1941, Stalin took over military operations, a job for which he was wholly unsuited, and Germany invaded the Soviet Union, catching Stalin off guard, despite him being warned by British intelligence that an attack was coming. The British had just broken the Enigma code. The Red Army's initial failures resulted in catastrophic losses. Stalin then executed 300 senior officers for incompetence by October 1941, though it was his own purges and poor decisions and ridiculous orders that had crippled the military's leadership. Seeing the brutality and incompetence of Stalin militarily, nearly 1 million Soviet citizens fled to German-occupied Eastern Europe. The largest contingent were Ukrainians, led by the anti-communist Stepan Bandera. Many joined the German military, which created 1 Ukrainian, 2 Russian, 2 Latvian, and 1 Estonian Waffen-SS division, as well as the 15th SS Cossack Cavalry Corps to fight Stalin. At the suggestion of Marshal Georgy Zhukov, Stalin brought back many of the generals he had sent to the gulags, those he did not kill, such as Konstantin Rokossovsky, a protege of Tukhachevsky who would save Moscow and plan Operation Bagration in 1944. Despite the early setbacks, with the reintroduction of competent field commanders, American Lend-Lease, and his massive industrial program, Soviet forces rebounded, winning crucial battles at Moscow, Stalingrad, and Kursk. Stalin later emerged as a key figure in Allied conferences, such as at Tehran in 1943 and Yalta in 1945, negotiating with Roosevelt, who was socialist-minded and admired Stalin, and Winston Churchill, who despised and distrusted him. Stalin wanted all Soviet POWs liberated by the Allies and all German soldiers captured east of the Elbe River handed over to him, and in return he would give Eastern Europe free elections. FDR believed him. Churchill did not. Roosevelt and Churchill wanted a Soviet commitment to enter the war against Japan, and Stalin agreed. Stalin's diplomatic cunning and never intending to honor his promises secured Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe, setting the stage for the Cold War. After Roosevelt's death, Stalin met Harry S. Truman, who, along with Churchill, held their Potsdam Conference. Truman, being of the same mindset as Churchill, did not trust Stalin, and Truman wanted all Americans in Soviet custody, such as downed air crews, handed over to complete the deal made with FDR. The Soviet prisoners returned to Stalin's control were killed or were sent to the gulags, as he had issued the order that there are no Soviet prisoners, only traitors and collaborators. This applied to his own son, Yakov, captured by the Germans, whom Stalin abandoned, and he would not entertain a prisoner exchange. When Stalin held his great victory parade in Red Square, not a single amputee could be seen out of the million military personnel present. That was because he sent many of them to gulags, so that they could not be seen, as their presence would have diminished the image of the perfect Soviet military man. Stalin and his policies had killed up to at least 30 million Soviet citizens before the war. He lost over 20 million during the war, and killed another 10 million or more after the war. With that depleted manpower, the lack of agricultural workers, which along with the drought that followed in 1945, this created a third famine that cost another 2 million lives by 1948. After the war, Stalin imposed communist regimes across Eastern Europe, violating promises of free elections. His control over Soviet society remained absolute, with renewed purges and repression. He supported North Korea's invasion of South Korea in 1950, but avoided direct military intervention. Stalin's paranoia intensified in his final years. The Doctors' Plot of 1953, accusing Jewish doctors of conspiring against Soviet leaders, was poised to trigger another massive purge, but Stalin died on March 5, 1953 in Moscow of a cerebral hemorrhage before it could be fully enacted. Stalin's rule left an indelible mark on the Soviet Union and the world. His policies industrialized the USSR, making it a global superpower, but at the cost of millions of lives. His reign was characterized by mass repression, forced labor, and economic policies that prioritized state control over individual well-being. Despite his role in defeating Nazi Germany, his legacy remains deeply controversial. His successors, particularly Nikita Khrushchev, a Ukrainian himself, denounced Stalin's excesses, yet Stalin's influence persisted in Soviet governance. The Cold War rivalry he helped instigate shaped global politics for decades. Ultimately, Stalin exemplified the paradox of totalitarianism, achieving national strength through brutality, leaving behind a legacy of both power and suffering. His impact continues to shape historical discourse, serving as a cautionary tale of the dangers of unchecked authority.
Cambodia was a nation under various regimes, from French colonial rule until the Japanese occupation in 1941, then again as a French colony until 1953, when it became an independent kingdom from 1953 to 1970. Later, it became a short-lived republic from 1970 to 1975 until overthrown by the Khmer Rouge regime in 1975, which ended in 1979. It remained a communist country until 1993, when it once again became a kingdom. Cambodia was a major sanctuary and supply base for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, where they were protected from American military operations until the election of President Richard M. Nixon in 1968. Following the end of the Allied involvement in Vietnam, a communist regime took power in Cambodia, just as one erupted in Laos, and millions would die as a result of one madman. What were the killing fields of Cambodia? Why did the communist regime of Vietnam go to war with its former communist ally and supporter? How did Pol Pot join Stalin, Mao, Hitler, and others in the pantheon of mass murderers?
Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, former soldier, Marine Corps scout sniper, history professor, historian, and book author. And we will answer these questions and other issues on this segment of Forgotten History.
Saloth Sar, better known by his nom de guerre, Pol Pot, was born on May 19, 1925, in Prek Sabav, located about 100 miles north of the Cambodian capital, Phnom Penh. He came from a rich family that owned some 50 acres of rice paddy, 10 times the national average. In 1934, Pol Pot moved to Phnom Penh, where he spent a year at a Buddhist monastery before attending a French Catholic primary school. In 1949, he went to Paris on a scholarship. While there, he studied radio technology and became quite active in communist groups. In January 1953, when Pol Pot returned to Cambodia, the whole region was in active revolt against French colonial rule. Cambodia officially gained its independence from France later that year, as did Indochina the next year, which became Vietnam and Laos. Pol Pot, meanwhile, joined the Communist Khmer People's Revolutionary Party, the KPRP, established in 1951 with support of the North Vietnamese in opposition to French occupation. From 1956 to 1963, Pol Pot taught history, geography, and French literature at a private school, while simultaneously plotting a revolution. During the Vietnam War, Cambodia was one of the few sanctuaries for Communist Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces fighting the Allied coalition. Cambodia was officially off-limits to American forces as they pursued the enemy along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and across the Mekong River. Norodom Sihanouk was the hereditary prince of the royal family and the national leader, but he was a political survivor, and when it suited him, he supported whichever political entity rose to the occasion. He courted Ho Chi Minh and China, entertained the communist revolutionaries in his country, and later supported Pol Pot and agreed with the programs of re-education. Due to Cambodia violating its self-stated neutrality in the war, in March 1969, U.S. President Richard M. Nixon ordered a secret bombing campaign as well as military ground operations into Cambodia to interdict and destroy enemy troops and camps. Over the span of 4 years, U.S. planes dropped 500,000 tons of bombs on Cambodia, more than 3 times the amount dropped on Japan during World War II. These operations killed tens of thousands of communist soldiers and supporters and brought the communists of China, North Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos even closer into a rather fragile alliance. By the time the U.S. bombing campaign ended in August 1973, the number of Khmer Rouge troops had increased exponentially, and they now controlled approximately 3/4 of Cambodia's territory. Soon after, they began shelling the capital Phnom Penh with rockets and artillery. The Cambodian Civil War was in full swing, and final assaults on the refugee-filled capital started in January 1975, with the Khmer Rouge bombarding the airport and blockading river crossings. China and North Vietnam were the primary Khmer Rouge supporters during the Civil War. As a result of their influence, the U.S. airlift of supplies failed to prevent thousands of children from starving. Finally, on April 17, 1975, the Khmer Rouge entered the city, winning the Civil War and ending the fighting. About 500,000 Cambodians had died during the Civil War, yet the worst was still to come. The Khmer Rouge communists and their insane leader Pol Pot came to power in 1975, and almost immediately the Khmer Rouge forcibly evacuated Phnom Penh's 2.5 million residents. Most of these were civil servants, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and other highly educated professionals. These people were deemed intellectuals and therefore anti-revolutionary, and they were stripped of their homes and private possessions and forced into slave labor, working in the fields and rice paddies with the peasants. The Khmer Rouge's most notorious prison, S-21, which held up to 20,000 prisoners, had only 7 survivors and was revealed in May 1979. That death camp was converted into the Tuol Sleng Genocide Museum. In fact, Pol Pot operated over 150 Khmer Rouge death camps. It seems ironic that a French-educated intellectual would purge all of the other intellectuals in the country to impose his communist ideals. But that was the Marxist game plan. Between 1975 and 1979, The Khmer Rouge genocide killed between 1.5 and 2 million people, nearly 25% of Cambodia's entire population. During the genocide, China was the main international patron of the Khmer Rouge, supplying more than 15,000 military advisors and most of its external aid, and therefore was complicit. This was all part of Pol Pot's re-education program, and it was a brutal process. One prime example of those targeted was Dr. Heng S. Ngor, who was trained as a surgeon and gynecologist. His practice was in the capital, Phnom Penh, when the Khmer Rouge seized control of the country and renamed it the Democratic Republic of Kampuchea. Thousands of highly educated people were murdered in their homes and in the streets in a political and social cleansing operation, as they were considered a threat to the limited intellects of the mainly illiterate peasant communist forces. Ngor knew that he had to conceal his education, medical skills, and even the fact that he wore glasses, which meant that he had financial means, ergo some form of high-paying employment, or running the risk of being perceived as an intellectual to avoid the new regime's intense hostility towards intellectuals and professionals. Dr. Ngor was expelled from Phnom Penh along with the bulk of its more than 2 million inhabitants as part of the Khmer Rouge's Year Zero social experiment. He and his wife, Mi Hoi, along with thousands of others, were imprisoned in a concentration camp, and she died giving birth along with their unborn child. Although he was a highly trained gynecologist, he was unable to treat his wife, who needed a cesarean section, as that would have ensured that they were all killed. Finally, after the guards were distracted during a mass execution and their attention was diverted by the Vietnamese army invading, he eventually crawled between Khmer Rouge and Vietnamese lines to safety in a Red Cross refugee camp, and eventually left with his niece for the United States. Dr. Ngor was unable to resume his medical practice in the United States, but he became an actor and starred with Sam Waterston in the highly acclaimed film The Killing Fields. Ngor is the only actor of Asian descent to win an Academy Award for Best Supporting Actor. At first, Pol Pot largely governed from behind the scenes. He became Prime Minister in 1976 after Prince Norodom Sihanouk was forced to resign. By that time, border skirmishes were occurring regularly between the Cambodians and the Vietnamese. The fighting intensified in 1977, and in December 1978, the Vietnamese sent more than 60,000 troops, along with air and artillery units, across the border. On January 7, 1979, they captured Phnom Penh and forced Pol Pot to flee back into the jungle, where he resumed guerrilla operations. The world was learning of the mass murders by Pol Pot in violation of all the existing conventions regarding armed conflict and human rights. This included more than 30,000 Vietnamese civilians who had been tortured and murdered by Pol Pot's forces. Thousands of Vietnamese were forcibly taken back across the border as slave labor to work the rice paddies and work on building projects. A prime example for the Vietnamese retaliation was the Ba Chuk massacre, when the Khmer Rouge tortured and killed the entire population of over 3,000 people, with only one woman surviving to tell the tale. Even communist Vietnam, with its own blood-stained history, had seen enough and invaded Cambodia in late 1978. In a clear display of communist fratricide, China, who supported Pol Pot's madness, invaded Vietnam in February 1979, a month after Vietnam captured Phnom Penh on January 9th. During the Cambodian genocide, the bones of millions of people who died from malnutrition, overwork, or inadequate health care joined those who were just executed, filling up the mass graves across the country. Under Pol Pot, the state controlled all aspects of a person's life: money, private property, jewelry, gambling. Most reading material and religions were outlawed. Agriculture was collectivized. Children were taken from their homes and forced into the military and communist indoctrination, the re-education camps, and strict rules governed sexual relations, vocabulary, how someone even spoke, and clothing. These laws were laid down and renamed in the name of the country Democratic Kampuchea. Throughout the 1980s, the Khmer Rouge received arms from China and political support from the United States, ironically enough, which opposed the decade-long Vietnamese occupation. But the Khmer Rouge's influence began to decrease following a 1991 ceasefire agreement, and the movement completely collapsed by the end of that decade. In 1997, a Khmer Rouge splinter group captured Pol Pot and placed him under house arrest. He died in his sleep in An Long Veng village, Odar Minji, on April 15, 1998, at age 72, due to heart failure. Despite the millions killed due to the tyrannical regime, the United Nations-backed Human Rights Criminal Tribunal has convicted only a handful of Khmer Rouge leaders for crimes against humanity.
Thank you for watching this episode of Forgotten History. If you liked what you saw, please click like, share, and subscribe. And if you would like to assist with the ever-increasing cost of production, please consider becoming a channel member and joining our Patreon page. Please check out our merchandise store. And thanks for watching.